For this particular application, we need to know which user of our database here is representing each session of the client that is connecting to our server through the WebSocket. So we, as a client, have to tell to the server, hey, I am the user A, for example, or I am Facundo. I have the credentials to be Facundo, because the server will have to know who is the client that is sending that message and to who the server have to send this message. So for example, if we see this particular chat with Facundo, that is the session of the left, and Gonzalo, who is the session of the middle of the screen, I, as Facundo, I can send a message to Gonzalo, the session of the middle, telling them, how are you? And when I press to this button, the message will send through the WebSocket, and the server will receive that message, and the server will have to identify to what client that is connected to the server, or not, maybe, through the WebSocket, have to send it so the client can receive that message and display to the screen. So in this case, I will send this message as Facundo, as the session 1 that is connected to the server through the WebSocket, and Gonzalo, that is another session, another client connected to the same server through another WebSocket, will have to receive that message because the server knows that this session corresponds to the user of Gonzalo. So how we do that? We send this message here, and Gonzalo received that message, and not other sessions. Only Gonzalo. Only the session of the middle, that is the session of the user Gonzalo. How we do that? Well, to do that, we have to tell to the server, hey, I am the user Facundo. These are my credentials as user Facundo. Verify that. And the server will have to store that data to reference that client, that connection client, with this particular identifier or this particular user ID, this particular user reference through our database to identify which client is which user. We map the client with that user. That's what the server have to do. So to do that, we will implement this method. When the client open a WebSocket, creating this new object, passing here the WebSocket protocol and the localhost or the URL where the server is running. Once the socket is open, we'll execute this event and then we'll execute this function. This function will send to the server a JWT token that is generated by the server when we log in. Every time that we log in, when I pass my credentials to the server, here I am receiving from the server a JWT token that I stored in the state of this React application. If you want to know how to implement JWT tokens and how to interact with those, I have a YouTube video in my channel. The link will be in the description too. I recommend that you understand perfectly JWT token before to try to understand WebSockets and how to implement WebSockets with JWT. Well, in this function, when the event on open is happen, so when the WebSocket is opened, the client will execute this function. This function creates an object of the type message, that is the structure of the message that the server creates. The server reads that particular structure or messages. So we have to create that structure with the arguments that we need to pass. We don't have to pass all of these arguments, but only that we consider that is relevant to the server for this case. So for this case, I just passed the user ID that I am. When I log into this application, I receive from the database my user ID. So here I pass to the server, hey, I am this client with this user ID. I am sending to you a JWT token using this argument. And this is the message that I will send you, which is the JWT token, JWT string. So the server will receive this JWT token as a message. So if we see how the WebSocket read messages, the WebSocket read messages with this function, this handler, that is connected to this endpoint of WS, which the endpoint that we call here. This handler creates the connection with the client with this function, and then we'll be here waiting for some message of the user. So when the server is open, immediately the client sends to the server a message, sends particularly this JWT token, the JWT token of the user. So we as a server, when we get some message, we get the payload, the array of bytes, and then we have to transform this byte to this structure that we see before using this body to message function that wraps the array of bytes to this specific structure. And then we just have to ask to this message if it's a JWT. If it's a JWT token, okay, we as a server are understanding that the client wants to show us his credentials so we can identify the user ID or the user of our database to this particular client, this particular session that is connected to us through the WebSocket. So we read the JWT token using this function that we get the ID of the user that is created in the database. We get the ID from this JWT token using this function. If the ID is nil, okay, it was an error transforming the JWT token and getting the ID. But if there is not an error, well, we just have to set the client ID to this ID. And then for this particular case, we will get the groups, all the groups that this user is on. For example, in this case, Facundo have two groups, the group number 1 and the group number 2. But Lucila, for example, have only one group, that is group number 2. So here we get all the groups of the client, so we can verify them when some session sends a message to a group. Well, if there is any session connected that is related to this particular group that is receiving a message, well, we have to send to this particular client the message that we received because this client belongs to this group. That's for that, only for that. And here, well, we just set to the client structure the groups that we get here from this function that is a simple query to the database. I forget to tell you that when the server creates the connection, then creates a client structure for this particular connection. So here is passing the connection that we get here, and here is the user ID, but the user ID that corresponds to the user of the database. But like here, in this particular moment, we don't know which user is the user that is making this connection. We have to put here some constant value like this to identify when a user is not validated. And here, finally, we just have to pass some empty array of integers that correspond to the groups of this particular user. I create this structure of client to handle better the connections because we have the connection of the WebSocket that is this basically the connection through the server to the client. Each client will have a connection, and here I aggregate these two items that is relevant for this particular case of this application, that is the ID and the groups. Getting back to the case of JWT token, we just have to set here the ID and the groups that is relevant for this particular case of the chat application, and then we will continue. So the server will be waiting here again and again for some new messages of the client. If there is not a JWT token, well, the server will ask for the client ID, because if their client ID is equal to -1, that means that the client is not authenticated through the WebSocket, because we don't know who is this client as WebSocket. So first, the client have to always, for this particular case, validate their identity, passing the JWT token first. And then, well, if the client ID is different from -1, well, If the message is for a group, we'll insert the message in a particular group. And if the message is for some particular user, well, it will insert the message for this particular user. These functions are just simple ASQL calls to store procedures that makes this insert into the tables and all the things that they have to do. The code of the ASQL functions, store procedures, and tables, it's here on the DB folder, SQL. Here you will have all the store procedures and here all the tables that I use for this application. You will find this also in the GitHub repo, in the server folder, then DB folder, SQL folder, and here is the store procedures, and here is the tables of the SQL. So getting back, once we insert the message in the particular tables and so on, then we send this message to the broadcast. The broadcast is a channel that contains messages. Those messages that are stored in this broadcast channel will be reading from this function, handle messages, that is running in the background with this go routine that is calling here. Every time that the server creates, well, the go routine goes to the background and start looping, waiting for, in this case, waiting for some message that is on the broadcast channel. So here, this function will be waiting here for some message that is entry to this broadcast. And here, well, we will receive that message and we'll iterate for each client that is connected to our server. In this case, I am only 3 sessions, like we can see here on the diagram. So will be 3 clients sessions connected. So we'll be iterate 3 times. And each time we have the client, for example, in this case, we will be the first client, the second client, and the third client. So for the first client, we have to ask us, this client have to receive this message? Well, for that, there is this function that solves that problem. And here is an if statement that asks to the message if there is for a group. If the message is for a group, well, we have to use this function of the structure of client. That is, this client belongs to this group. If the client belongs to this group, it's okay. This message is for you because you belong to this group. This function belongs to this group. Iterate for each group ID that is stored in this array of integers. And if the ID that we pass here as a parameter match with the group ID that we are iterating, returns true. That makes that this ID that we pass here as a parameter belongs to the group's ID that this client is stored in this array. And if the function iterate for each group and doesn't exist the ID that we pass here, well, this session doesn't have the rights to receive that message. This client doesn't have to receive this message, so returns false. Now, if the message is not for a group, it's just for a particular client, a particular user, well, it's more simple because we just have to make sure that the message structure have the toID parameter argument that indicates to who is this message, which user will receive this message. So here is the ID of the recipient of the message. And well, we just have to match it with the client ID that we are iterating. For example, here we send this message to Gonzalo. So the server have 3 connections: Facundo, Gonzalo, and Lucila. These 3 clients are connected to the server. So here, the server receive that message from the broadcast, iterate for each client, ask himself, have to receive this message, this client? Well, first of all, imagine that the server contains Facundo as the first client of this loop. The message is for a group? No. Okay, so the message to ID is equal to the client ID? And no, because to ID is Gonzalo. The to ID argument is Gonzalo. That is 2, the ID number 2. And Facundo, the client that it's here, have the ID number 1. So this will return false, and this will go back here and iterate again for other client. Here is the client number 2, Gonzalo. We ask if this client, this particular client, have to receive this message. So the message is for a group? No. The message is for a particular person? Okay. here, the else statement. The message that toID is equals to the client ID. Yes, here, yes, because toID is 2 and the client ID is 2. Okay, that's true. We'll print this and we'll send the message. To send the message, we make this. We marshal the message, the structured message. We transform that structure into array of bytes because we have to send through the WebSocket an array of bytes. We check if there is an error, and then we send for this particular client. Using this connection, we write the message using this type of message, text message, and here passing the array of bytes. Also, we check if there is an error. If there is not an error, okay, this send function ends and will iterate again. For the third and finally the last client session connected to this WebSocket, to this server. So it's the client number 3 with ID number 3, which is Lucila. So we ask again, have this user have to receive this message, this client? Okay. The message is for a group? No. Okay. The message toID is equal to the client.id? No, because message toID is equal to client.id. No, because message toID is equal to 2 and the client ID is equal to 3. So this will return false, this will return false, so it will be looping again. But the client ends and, well, the for loop will be waiting here again for new messages that are stored in this broadcast channel. So now we will see how the chat groups works with this particular server. So if you can see here, the session 1 is Facundo, the session 2 is Gonzalo, the session 3 is Lucila. Facundo is friend of Gonzalo, Gonzalo is friend of Facundo and Lucila is only friend of Gonzalo. But Facundo, Gonzalo, and Lucila have the same group, that is the group number 2. So if we go into this group for each user, we will see that we can send messages, and as Facundo and Gonzalo and Lucila will receive that message, will have to receive that messages, and they have to identify who is that is sending that message. So if I send a message to this group as Facundo, hello, I am Facundo, and send that message, I can see here in my session as Facundo, but also I can see here in my session of Gonzalo. And here is telling me that the user ID of the user that sends this message is Facundo. Obviously, I could put here some image, but it's more quickly put here some identifier. And Lucila also knows that this message is sent for the user with ID number 1. So each user knows from who user is this message. So each user of this group will know from which user is sending these messages. For example, if I am Gonzalo, it's the same. Facundo will notice that Gonzalo, or the user ID number 2, sent this message, and Lucila, the same, will notice that this particular user with ID number 2 send this particular message. We'll try it for Lucila too, and the same here. Facundo noticed that this user that sends this message is the user with ID number 3. Gonzalo noticed that he is receiving this message from the user number 3, and well, we already know how works this entire server, this entire WebSocket, and how we can make this chat application works. Because it's just sending messages, and the server have to understand who is the user that is sending this message, and understand also to who I have to send this message. Who is the client session that have to receive this message that this other client sends to me. When the server understands that, we just have completed the main thing of this chat application. And well, I think that that's all for this video. I hope that you really understand better how WebSocket works, how implement a WebSocket using a React application, and in this case, a Golang server, and also how this chats application works, how the server have to think to make the things that the server wants, or in this case, the application wants, that is receiving and sending messages to each session that is connected, and these sessions have to be identified by the server from a particular way that can understand who is the user that is behind this session to, well, know, okay, this client is the user Facundo, and this session is the user Gonzalo. So the server can, well, know to who user I have to send this particular message that I receive from another client, another user, another session that is connected to me through the WebSocket. So if you have any doubts about WebSockets or anything, let me know on the comments. I will respond you. Also, I ask you again, to you, that hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, because that helps me a lot to grow up on YouTube. Okay? So I hope that you enjoyed the video, and also the main important thing is that you understand all about WebSockets. See you on the next video.